Hello, everyone. It is our pleasure to welcome all of you to this event. On behalf of LLILAS BENSON, it's an honor for us to host the presentation of the book, Radical Cartographies, Participatory Mapping in the Americas. We are particularly proud of this publication because it's the product of our LLILAS faculty research initiative entitled Participatory Mapping and the Struggle for Land and Resources, led by Professor Sletto and launched almost 10 years ago. This initiative was one of the most successful interdisciplinary clusters of LLILAS affiliated faculty that we supported. They organized a large conference in Bogota in 2012 that attracted experts from around the world, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. They had follow-ups workshops in Rosario and UT Austin to finalize the book. Today, we celebrate the fruit of this labor with this book. Congratulations to all you, to all the authors. If I have wine, I will toast you. I'm going to toast you with coffee. Congratulations. We have several speakers today. I apologize, we won't be able to introduce you with bios. We need to use the time in the best possible way. We are going to start with Dan Durante, Executive Director of UT Press, then Bjørn Sletto from UT Community and Regional Planning. We will follow with Bryan from University of Colorado Boulder, then David Pereira from LLILAS BENSON, Alfredo Wagner from Nova Cartografia Social de Amazônia, then Charles Hale from University of California, Santa Barbara. Then we will have a Q&A, and we ask you to post your questions on our Facebook page. We will finalize this event with Professor Zazueta, our Associate Director, who's going to close on behalf of LLILAS BENSON. Thank you so much, and let me pass now this to Dan Durante.
Hello, thank you so much. As Paloma said, my name is Dawn Durante. I'm the editor-in-chief of University of Texas Press. I'm here with one of my colleagues, Andrew Nadeau, who worked closely as assistant editor with the acquisitions editor on the volume, Carrie Webb, who would have loved to be here with us today, but had a last-minute commitment come up. And she shared some words that I'll be reading for her today. Carrie wanted to say that Radical Cartographies is a perfect example of the kind of book I enjoy working on most as an acquisitions editor at the University of Texas Press. It demonstrates how scholarly work can be applied in tangible ways that move well beyond an academic audience to also support Indigenous, Afro-descendant, and other traditional communities under environmental, political, and physical displacement. I've learned so much personally in working with Bjørn, Joe, Alfredo, and Charlie in understanding how participatory mapmaking works in communities under threat, and I hope that all kinds of readers in the academy, in activist groups, and in communities throughout the Americas as they fight for historic lands, structure boundaries for local governance, and reimagine the self, will find inspiration as well as a guide to apply these practices to protect their rights. I'll also add that this book speaks to so many of the press's commitments disciplinarily, geographically, politically, and very specially supporting the work going on right here at our home campus. Thank you so much for allowing the press to have a role in this volume and also to have a role in this event here today.
Professor Sletto.
So much, Paloma and Dawn. I'm going to share very briefly my screen with some slides that I put together for this purpose. So my name again is Bjørn Sletto. I'm Associate Professor in Community and Regional Planning here at UT Austin. And it's been my great pleasure to work with a wonderful group of people on this volume. And I wanted to take the opportunity, probably go over my 5 minutes, but my opportunity to just say some thanks to some very important people in this regard. I really want to thank Paloma for organizing this event and for your tireless work on organizing the mapping conference in Bogota, which really was the origin of this book.
Bjørn has asked me to translate to Spanish. Voy a traducir en español. Bjørn quiere agradecerle a Paloma Diaz por la organización de este evento y por su trabajo incansable en la organización de la conferencia sobre mapeo que ocurrió en Bogotá en 2011, la que fue la génesis de este libro.
I also want to thank Carrie Webb, who's been a wonderful partner in this project. She's believed in this project, and she's been very patient because this is taking about 6 years of work with UT Press to finish this. And also Andrew for all your work on shepherding this book through the editing and the proofreading stages.
Bjørn también le gustaría agradecer a Carrie Webb de UT Press por creer en este proyecto y apoyarlo pacientemente a través del desarrollo del libro, lo que llevó casi 7 años. También a Andrew Nattop de UT Press por guiar el proceso editorial del borrador y el manuscrito final.
I want to thank Joe, co-editor Joe Bryan, for just incredible commitment to this work and your wonderful, thoughtful contributions and patience as we conceptualize this book. It's been great working with you.
Bjørn también le gustaría agradecer a Joe Bryan de la Universidad de Colorado por sus contribuciones analíticas, por su paciencia, por su trabajo duro durante el proceso de conceptualización y de organización de nuestra conferencia y finalmente durante el proceso de desarrollo del manuscrito.
And Alfredo Wagner, Professor Wagner in Brazil, for really being a wonderful mentor and being a leader in this field for so many years, and for really spearheading the Brazilian contributions to this volume.
También le gustaría agradecer a Alfredo Wagner por su guía y por su liderazgo en este campo y por supervisar las contribuciones brasileras a este volumen y especialmente por asistir al proyecto con financiamiento y traducciones.
Charlie, Hale, for just being a wonderful mentor, for guiding this project through all these years, and just for your wonderful, critical, thoughtful insights around engaged scholarship.
Queremos agradecer a Charlie Hale por iniciar este proyecto y dar guía y liderazgo a través del proceso, por su guía crítica, por sus contribuciones analíticas, no solo al proceso del mapeo, sino también al proceso de una investigación comprometida.
And Claudia Leal was an amazing partner in this work. She is with the Universidad de los Andes in Colombia, and she did so much work or co-organizing the conference that I'm going to tell you more about soon, and managing a large group of students and faculty and handle all the logistics. And so I want to really thank her for that.
A Claudia Leal de la Universidad de los Andes en Bogotá, Colombia, por sus increíbles esfuerzos como coorganizadora y como anfitriona de la conferencia de mapeo del 2011, la que incluyó un largo equipo de estudiantes y profesores quienes ayudaron con el proceso de logística, de traducciones, de alojamiento, etcétera, etcétera. Y finalmente, gracias por ayudarnos a crear ese espacio productivo de diálogo en Bogotá.
And Deborah Berry, who was instrumental in getting this started through funding and support she provided through her work at the Rights and Resource Initiative.
A Deborah Berry de la Iniciativa de Recursos y Derechos por darnos liderazgo, pero también apoyo financiero para hacer la conferencia en Bogotá posible.
And finally, just a host of students here at UT who are really instrumental in working with me to make this happen, including in Bogotá as well as here in Austin. Marla Torado, Christina Wershing, Heather Teague, and Caroline Daigle.
Finalmente, nuestros estudiantes de UT Austin, incluyendo a Marla Torrado, Cristina Wershing, Heather Teague, Caroline Daigle, quienes asistieron en investigación, con la organización de la conferencia, la promoción, la traducción del libro. A todos, gracias por su arduo trabajo.
So very briefly, I wanted to just share a few thoughts on participatory mapping, sort of where we are coming from, contextualizing our work. We're talking here about mapping that's really done by communities, that's very much based in place, situated in place-based epistemologies, social relationships, this relationship with landscape, with indigenous situated iconographies. So exemplified, for instance, in the work that I've been fortunate to be part of in Venezuela. So it's often done in context of struggles over resources and territorial rights. often this work has been done in partnership with professionals, technicians hailing from outside the communities. And there have been some risks associated with that in terms of perhaps process of being too expert-led, perhaps even disempowering in some cases. So we wanted to really explore the sort of the innovations that are taking place in participatory mapping that's really emerging from indigenous and Afro-descendant communities throughout Latin America. And really focus on these emerging practices, and which is why we ended up titling the book Radical Cartographies, to sort of show this new wave of work in the region. And we also wanted to really share experiences and insight from different types of geographies and contexts, especially urban contexts as well. And ultimately produce, co-produce texts that really cross a lot of boundaries, epistemological, linguistic, and other boundaries to make a contribution to the colonial scholarship. So as we mentioned before, this really got its start, I would say, in the conference that we organized through RRI at the University de los Andes in 2011. And over the course of 2 days, we had these amazing conversations organized by the editorial group and also professors like Claudio Leal from Uniandes and RI. And I just want to put out the names here of students from Uniandes who were really just wonderful supporters in this work. We had 31 speakers from 14 different countries, and really starting this conversation and learning a lot from one another, starting this co-production. That has resulted in memorias and an edited conference volume. That is indeed available for download, and perhaps Paloma can receive emails from those of you who might want to access this volume. It's free to download, it's in Spanish. I want to point out the very interesting writing process as we co-produce this volume. And you see this goes back to 2011. We had a workshop co-sponsored by Latin American Studies, as well as other institutions at UT here in February 2014. And many of the authors who ended up publishing in this book actually participated in this workshop, and this is where we really made great strides forward in our writing of the different chapters. We also had numerous other in meetings and encounters and Skype calls, and as we worked together on this, and I just shared this picture from my visit to Manaus, where I was happy to work with Davi and Emmanuel on their chapters. Very, very quickly, I wanted to just very quickly summarize the chapters in a few words, because it's a great diversity of perspectives from across the region. So the first part loosely relates to questions of landscape, with Tiago Cruz writing on quilt making as a concept to understand the role of memory in mapping. Alvaro Velasco, social polygraphy as a way of producing speaking maps, as he refers to. Nalua Silva, working in Venezuela in the Caura River area in eastern Venezuela, looking at co-production and emergence through participatory mapping. Second section of the book really focuses more on territorial concerns and struggle. And Wendy Pinera has written on her work in the Peruvian Rio Corrientes River Basin, where they have been using participatory mapping to contend with and contest the oil industry. Pablo Mancilla and Miguel Melin working on a mapping in Mapuche territory in Chile, focusing on the encroachment there, hydroelectrical power specifically. Alfredo Viteri and Alexandra Lamenia have worked on participatory mapping from communal land and resource management in the Quechua de Pastaza in Ecuador. Carlos Gonzalez, territorial planning also in the Cauca Valley in Colombia. And finally, a section that focuses more on questions of identity. Alfredo Wagner, we will hear from soon, theoretical intervention on ethnography. Manuel, wonderful text on identity formation in urban indigenous communities. Maria Nahuel, focusing on new innovative GIS and internet technologies using Neuquén in Argentina. And finally, David Pereira, work on social cartography and Quilombola territoriality. So that was, then we conclude with the commentary from Joe and Charlie. So with that, I wanted to thank everybody again, all the authors, for their incredible patience over the course of almost 10 years of putting this book together. So that was it for me. Thank you.
Thank you. We are going to go next to Bryan from Universidad de Colorado.
Okay, thank you, and welcome to everyone tuning in online. As Bjørn says, this book was really the product of a lot of conversations and collaborations over the years. And I think that a lot of them, you know, they took place in these meetings he described, but they also go beyond that. And they pick up these really fundamental questions about, like, what is a territory? How do you map it? What is a community? And a lot of these answers are already kind of given to us through international indigenous rights law, through anthropological understandings of sort of cultural difference, and through cartographic norms themselves. And I think one of the real interesting things about this volume is that all of the chapters contest those things in their own ways and make a real contribution to our understanding of mapping broadly construed. But I think also there's an important piece of this too, that these are conversations that didn't just happen in these meetings. They're conversations that, at least in my case, have really shaped my entire approach to mapping and even the reason why I got involved in mapping to begin with. So some of the contributors to this volume have actually shaped my intellectual trajectory from a very early date. So back early in the 1990s, working with Alfredo Viteri in Ecuador, this was sort of the first time that I ever sort of thought about using maps in the context of land claims. And it was guided really by Viteri's political vision for how to confront the challenges they were facing from oil extraction in the Amazon basin of Ecuador. That continues on more recently to my collaborations with Kialo Cruz in the Sierra Norte of Oaxaca. Those started through a whole variety of conflicts and contentions around mapping that I've detailed in other work. But one of the things that came out of that project was really understanding that Zapotec communities weren't just sort of the passive recipients or just fulfilling the sort of role of community guide in these mapping projects. They had their own understandings of space, their own understandings of how communities were organized, and their own approaches to mapping. And that, on the one hand, there are some of those things are very specific to the Sierra Norte and to the Rincon Zapoteco, that Chiaro writes about in his chapter. But they also echo broader themes that are certainly there in many of the other chapters in this book, but also have informed and driven my own experience with mapping along the way. Because these questions about what is a territory, how do you map it, what is a community, they aren't just academic questions. These are questions that come up in the context of mapping projects routinely. And every time there's a new sort of answer or new take to that, that comes out of these mapping projects that can and should be really recognized as an important source of not just sort of political content, but also of theory. And I think that the chapter from Mancia and Melin about mapping in Wallmapu in Chile really sort of puts this point home when they talk really eloquently about developing a Mapuche language of cartography. And so there's a couple of then kind of key political things that I would add to this, or intellectual contributions. One has to do with the way that all of these chapters offer sort of critiques of what we might call cartographic reason or a cartographic ideal that oftentimes assumes a direct relationship between the territory and the map, where the map represents the territory. And this is oftentimes disciplined then through adherence to a set of sort of technical practices associated with cartography. All of these chapters really push against that ideal without sort of saying that maps are somehow useless. In a real way, they take up these questions and use them to get at the sort of difficulties of mapping and the difficulties of struggling for territory under the current conditions, as much as they vary from place to place. And the second contribution is that they really reinforce what was increasingly recognized in academic geography as the importance of seeing mapping as a process, or cartography as a process, which kind of explodes it out of this idea that cartography is just something that's done by individuals, individual cartographers or surveyors, and takes it into a multiplicity of practices that include both how we read maps, how they're interpreted, how they circulate, but also ultimately how we make maps as well. And those two contributions are really highlighted in the chapters of this book. I think that readers will find them particularly useful, and I think that they should really make a significant contribution to how we think about mapping broadly construed across multiple disciplines. So thank you.
Hi, we are going to invite now Davi Pereira from LLILAS BENSON UT Austin.
Thank you, Paloma. I just want to introduce Alfredo a little bit about the project New Social Cartography. So Alfredo is an anthropologist in Brazil. He has dedicated about 40 years working with the traditional people in Brazil. In the past 20 years, he has focused on Amazon. 2005, he has started the New Social Cartography project. That's basically is bring together people from academy and people from community social movement to produce knowledge using map for claiming social rights or claiming land rights from Brazilian government. So, and the New Social Cartography become a large network of research in social map in Brazil, with connection in Latin America, Africa, also US, especially and UT. And yeah, I think the contribution of the network of New Cartography for book is the possibility to bring together academic and knowledge from the communities. Thank you.
Thanks, Davi. We are going to share now the video that Alfredo has sent us. We have a voiceover in English, so you can follow his presentation. Allow me a second until I find the right screen here. Give me a second.
I would like to present some of the work of the New Social Cartography of the Amazon project, which focuses fundamentally on drafting maps, which is the start of our work. This shows all the different shoreline communities.
Let me start at the beginning to see if I can share the screen here. Give me a second.
I would like to present some of the work of the New Social Cartography of the Amazon project, which focuses fundamentally on drafting maps, which is the start of our work. this shows all the different shoreline communities in relation to their activities in an area that was threatened by the construction of dams. Fortunately, mobilization movements managed to deter this mega project, and the communities have not been displaced in the case of the pepper-grown communities. Also, an important piece of information is this work of ours in the area of babaçu plantations, which includes the states of Maranhão, Pará, Piauí, and Tocantins. It's an area of nearly 26 million hectares. And this area is important because there are 400,000 babaçu farms that are extracting vegetable oil from the babaçu. There is a large organization centered on this interstate babaçu growing movement. This is very important for us, and we made a social cartography of babaçu plantations, a complete ecological mapping of the babaçu. Here we also have another draft of a map that is very important, a map of the Purus River in Amazonas state, where there are many indigenous peoples who are mobilizing. So we make a sketch for these people, and we produce mapping workshops, and we go about patiently working on perfecting our maps. Here we have some big projects, that is, a social team working on big projects. This region in green is the Matopiba region. Here's the railroad, the Interstate Highway 63, ports, airports, dams, and other mega projects that are expected to happen in the Amazon. And these projects are all here described, and they show that all of this business is working with the new plantations. So the cartographic work here was all done in collaboration with big associations like the Federation of Rural Workers of Maranhão, also with the Syndicate of Rural Workers of Alcântara, with the babaçu coconut breakers and other movements, like the Quilombo residents of Pará, all of which gave consistency to this map. Here we have details of the areas occupied by mineral mines. There we have another map of Amazonas state produced with the different movements. Here's the Madeira complex, where there are 2 large dams on the border with Bolivia. And on the Bolivian side, 2 dams were expected to be built, but with the recent coup d'etat, we don't know what the future holds for this region. Here's Amazonas state with all its indigenous lands, the traditionally occupied lands. Here's the region of the Negro River Valley, which also includes certain well-marked indigenous communities and lands near the border with Venezuela. In this region, the presence of indigenous people is very important. Here's a laboratory. Here we have a map of the city of Belém too, which also took a lot of work. And here's a map showing the children and adolescents in the Abaetetuba region along the Tocantins River. And with that, we have just about covered Maranhão, Pará, and Amazonas. Here we have a map of the Bahé indigenous community of Nossa Senhora do Livramento, which has been an important factor for the production later on of different parts of maps and informative bulletins made by the new social cartographies of the Amazon project. That is to say that all this work is done beginning with the communities. The researchers don't do anything. They help the communities to transform their drafts into maps. That's our job. Here we have a map that shows all of the indigenous lands in the Amazon region, which consists of 590 million hectares, and all of the indigenous lands in the mining proceedings, which consist of 11 phases, from research authorizations to ideas for the extraction of diamonds and other minerals. You can see here all of the superimposed overprints, and you can see that in the heart of the Amazon, here where the Tapajós River and the Interstate Highway 630 come together, You can see the concentration here of mining prospects, which are shown in purple. It's a large concentration. And this region here last year was labeled an area of fires, since many fires were started there. For us, it's very important that this be very clearly shown. The other areas show a juxtaposition, that is, how mining proceedings are crossing into indigenous territories. The new Social Cartographies project has also been producing mappings during the pandemic. This one here shows indigenous people who died between the months of May and July of 2020 during the pandemic. We opted to produce something that would be more of a portrait with personal information, obituaries, biographical information, and stories about deceased indigenous peoples, as well as Quilombo residents. There's another map of Quilombo residents. And we've made all of these maps available to the public. That is to say that these aren't cold statistics. They contain personal information and photos. And when we weren't able to obtain photos, we obtained lists, such as the one we received from the Cocama Federation of the Tabatinga region on the border with Peru and Colombia. Also there in the back, we have another chart that tracks those who have died. We worked a lot on this situation in our last book, entitled Pandemic and Territory. And finally, we managed to work also in the area of the Trombetas River, which is important because it helps us to gain a better visual of the region of Alto Juruá in the state of Acre, which we were also able to map entirely thanks to the help of indigenous contacts. So that is what the new social cartography project consists of, and it has been called a radical cartography. For us, this is very important because it presupposes the permanent participation of traditional indigenous peoples and communities. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Alfredo, we wish you could be here. You are one of the nicest people I ever met. We are going to go next with Charlie Hale. Charlie, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready. It's a great honor to be here and a privilege to take part in this book launch. I want to start by echoing Paloma and Davi and Bjørn and Joe in calling out, giving a shout out and a deep and heartfelt recognition to Alfredo Wagner and the new Social Cartography project. In addition to being a leader in social cartography and radical cartography, it's also a real model for us on, as Alfredo was just explaining, how basically community-based mobilizations can have a place in universities and can work together, really leading important research in creating both scholarly products and also work that's very important for their own struggles. And that's very much in the spirit of this book. Even virtually, being back at LLILAS brings to me a host of emotions, from nostalgia to connections with old friends and colleagues, and also gratitude for all the fit from and thinking about how to do that work in other places. Budget management, but by far the most important and most exciting for me of the kind of legacy of LLILAS is the urgency and the importance and the incredible experience of collaborative research. we made a requirement for these faculty-led research initiatives that they would build on deep collaborative relations with colleagues and partners in Latin America, and that the results of the research would both have scholarly rigor and also clear contributions, ethically engaged, politically engaged contributions to the settings where the collaborations are taking place. And of all the many faculty-led initiatives, I think this one that Bjørn Sletto proposed back in 2010 meets and surpasses those requirements in an exceptional way. And it's a good thing because 10 years is an awfully long time. If all we were doing is producing a scholarly product, that would be great and worth celebration. But as Joe made very clear, there's an enormous set of objectives and benefits along the way that had to do with the contributions on the accompaniment of social struggles in the area of territorial rights, of contesting extractivist projects that are damaging to indigenous and Afro-descendant lifeways, and many more. I was particularly excited about this project because in my own experience as a researcher, there's no work that I have done that's been more gratifying than what the Proyecto calls Mapamiento Social. It produces rich and original knowledge, and also those who participate and really guide the project have a clearly larger sense of purpose of what the research is about. And I think this book is a resounding affirmation of those principles and a real beacon for work in other areas. And it's also very important that it is radical cartography, as others have mentioned. And we would be remiss not to note and pause on the troubling fact that this kind of scholarship is under very direct threat. The executive order that recently came from the White House that basically criminalizes the work of critical race theory, I'm sure would be expanded to include radical cartography if they knew what that was. And it's very important to recognize the storm clouds on the horizon and to be particularly vigilant and stalwart in our defense of this kind of scholarship in the face of these threats. So for more than a decade, LLILAS has been at the vanguard of these efforts to bring forth scholarship that advances our highest ideals of social justice and at the same time produces original and exciting scholarship. I want to thank UT Press for their confidence in this project from the beginning, and a great word of congratulations to all the authors, and hopes that it will be used amply both in university settings and in the settings from which the research emerged. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. We are going to start reading the questions that we are receiving on Facebook and on Twitter. So far, we have received a number of congratulations. I want to read one particularly from Chile, from my country. Greetings from Mapu, Territorio Mapuche. We are thankful to be part of this process of radical cartography, and we value the contributions of all the pueblos originarios de America Latina. Special greetings to Bjørn. I have a question meanwhile we're collecting other questions, and I'm always curious about how this process overlap or maybe can work together with the new Google Maps process. Are those two very different things? They don't take into account each other, or they have been more receptive to embrace findings and claims coming from participative mapping? I don't know, Bjørn can answer, or any other of the authors.
I can start with a very brief comment in that regard. I think that one example of this is Maria's work in Neuquén in Argentina, where they are experimenting with new, with internet-based mapping and Google Maps for this purpose. I think it has a lot of potential, and you of course have the issue of the digital divide and so the accessibility to the technology. But I see this experimentation happening more and more. I don't know if Joe and Davi, Charlie would like to add something to that.
There is one question from Sara Villamizar. She would like to know much more about the process, how the idea was conceived, and what were the steps behind the book.
I can start with that as well, if you like. I would say that the start probably was the conference in Bogota in 2011, even though all of us have worked with participatory mapping in years before then. That was the moment when Charlie and I started really working together and discussing this topic, and Joe generously joined us for these conversations. And I think that was the start of bringing together this group. And we also, I think we also started then to conceptualize this sort of newer, radical cartographies. And it's really, I think this is really an iterative co-production process. I think we, now looking back, I think we have some answers and we can sort of articulate pretty well what this ended up looking like. But I think this evolved really through all these conversations that we had and all this learning from each other. Like Joe said, in multiple different ways in addition to the conference. Charlie, would you like to add something?
Just add a quick comment on Paloma's question, which I think actually builds on what Joe was saying. For me, one of the meanings of the radical is this idea that sort of dominant society, Cartesian cartography is used by these projects and at the same time is actively refused and reformulated always in the spirit of the struggle in course, and also the larger objectives, which usually involve some kind of autonomy, self-determination, refusal of the power of the state and dominant structures. And so that Google Maps probably would be very useful in the use part of that equation, but and the radical valence of these projects would also require some pretty significant reformulation. And I think that sort of couplet that Joe mentioned is more crucial now than ever as communities and other kinds of social struggles really need to find their own way in contraposition to state-defined parameters of rights, of mapping, and so forth.
We have another question from, so go ahead.
I was wondering if Joe had something that you wanted to add in this regard.
Yeah, I would just add that I think everything that Charlie and Bjørn has said is really picks up on key points. And, you know, part of what's so interesting about these mapping projects, right, is we have this vision that a map is going to be used to locate an indigenous or Afro-descendant territory within the broader sort of space of the state. And that sort of visualization is there with us in a very dominant way. And what these maps do oftentimes, or these mapping processes do, is they rethink all of those sorts of relationships. And, you know, it can be both profound and mundane. I mean, there are ways of thinking about, well, it's not really about locating a territory within the state so much as it is about what's the sort of relationship we want to have to the state politically. And so there gets to these very sort of fundamental questions around state power that others have addressed. but there's also a certain creativity that's involved in sort of how we understand and think space, right? And I think that the Mancia and Melin chapter and then the Cruz chapter both really experiment with this form in really productive ways. The Cruz chapter in particular talks about sort of the oral histories about using jaguars to map a territory, and then contrast that with a more recent case of a jaguar that was trapped after it had killed quite a few cows and chickens and other animals, and was removed from the territory, but then the community decided to bring it back. And this jaguar was fitted with a GPS collar so that it could be tracked and monitored. And the idea of sort of those two things working together to map a new territory is, if nothing else, a very provocative way of kind of thinking some of these relationships in a different way. And there are many other examples that have happened since then, right? So the group that Chiaro Cruz is affiliated with, Surco in Oaxaca, for example, did sort of crowdsource mapping using cell phones of the damage from the earthquake in 2017 in Mexico, where you had this tremendous set of earthquakes in Oaxaca. Very little bit was known, and they were receiving text messages and then putting that up on a Google Earth map that was basically making effects of that earthquake visible that were otherwise just going to be completely ignored and looked over by the kind of state and humanitarian relief apparatus that came into play after the earthquake.
I have a question here. Paloma posted that I would love to hear David, if you would be interested in answering this question from, it's from Sarah Villamizar, and she's asking if you could talk about how radical geovisualization, radical cartographies create new forms of engagement with the state. I don't know, from your perspective, working in the Quilombola territoriality and struggles, how does participatory mapping, radical cartographies, facilitate new forms of engagement with the state? That's something you want to talk about?
Yes, and this is an interesting question because in Brazil you have a tradition of the make coming from the state. Right now, the communities are invest this logic, like the community are able to make their own map and go to the state, say this is my territory. So it's no longer to the community are waiting for the state to say and shape the territory, because we have like different way to think about territory, and state way and the community way is about antagonists talk about territory. So also is when the community, I think when the community make their own map, they put this map things who is important for them. It's different from the state because since they don't share the same view about the meaning of the territory, about the meaning of the maps. Of course, this makes the community map more strong when they use it to claim some rights from the state.
Davi, do you mind if I follow up? Because there's a question that is very much related to conversations we have had recently, given the presidency in Brazil and what's happening in Maranhão right now. We have a question from Fernando Galeana, who is asking, what do you think are the future challenges for radical indigenous cartography?
I think the first one is the indigenous or black communities is still able to use that, because in case of Brazil, Brazil government tried to find a way to prohibit indigenous and Black communities make mapping. They try to invalidate this in court via and make laws to say only the only map you can use for clean rights should be the map that state doing. This discussion in Brazil have like a long time, like since 2010. So the challenge is like, and to guarantee the right the community to map in the territory. Nobody knows better the territory than the people who live there.
We see a question here for, I think it's from Monica Erba. How the authors of the publication understand the line or difference between using indigenous peoples as guides and considering them as participants in the research and creators in the cartographic project?
Charlie, would you like to take that on?
It's a good Charlie question.
Charlie question. It's an engaged scholarship question. Charlie.
Yeah, that's a good question with a good, I think, a very healthy edge to it. And I think that it would be hubris to say that that any of these efforts always achieve the goal that we enunciate and set out. And I think there's been actually some very interesting work coming out of a younger generation of Davi's generation of scholars at the University of Texas that is questioning the activist research methods that we taught around a combination of feminist critique and just thinking through how the sort of contradictions of activist research. And I think it's really important for that critical scrutiny to always be there. This is not it's never a finished product. It's always, I think, Bjørn said this, or Joe, is always a process. And so I think humility is probably the first and most important principle. In terms of trying to draw that distinction, Alfredo in his video, I think, said it pretty well. The ideal is that the research objectives and even the control of ultimately of the knowledge produced should remain in the hands of the organized group in struggle that produces that gives impetus for the process. And when that works, it creates a very different kind of relationships, power relations in the research process, because the assumption is that researchers come with superior knowledge and ultimately know what to do with the information, and that premise is being directly challenged. And so I think the ideal is that these projects start with dialogues, that the kind of dialogue that Davi, because I had the honor of visiting Alcantara with him, the kind of long-term dialogues that you have with communities where they're framing objectives for this work. What do they want to get out of the research? And that's not always 100% overlap with what scholars think or what scholars end up academy-based researchers want to do, but there's enough of an overlap and a sense of protagonism of the in this Black or Indigenous community, so that relationship of research process, research practice really does get challenged and transformed. And I think finally, I would say that one of the things that we've kind of come to is when it feels difficult and uncomfortable and contradictory, that's a pretty good sign that that some of that challenge is actually being realized. And so it's a very important question that you pose, and one that should be subject of much humble dialogue.
Charlie, I would also agree that the first word that comes to mind is humility. I always try to talk about that in my classes as well, and it's sort of it has to do with, I think, taking process seriously, like Joe explained. Resist the tendency to be overly focused on the output, the map, the product, final product, and practice reflexivity. So I guess I'm putting a lot of onus on the individuals engaged in this process in terms of approaching it with a sense of humility and reflexivity. Joe, did you want to add something to this?
No, I think you covered things really well. I mean, I think there are some big new challenges though, right? I think that one aspect around mapping, and this gets to some of the questions that have been raised, it looks like online, is a tendency to use culture to kind of draw those boundaries. And even in our most sort of critical efforts, oftentimes cultural difference is a strong factor in where boundaries are drawn and how the sort of space that's defined by map is organized. And there's nothing wrong per se with that, but where things start to go a little sideways sometimes is when culture becomes overemphasized in that process. And here's where you get sort of speaking a little bit to the question about how this work looks on the ground. You know, oftentimes hierarchies of gender and class, both within the community and among the sort of experts that are brought in, play out in real time in the maps as far as who goes out to the forest and who decides what to map and how that mapping gets done. And that's a real, it's on the one hand, it's kind of overdetermined to be that way, because if you want to make a land claim, you need to sort of claim this large area of land. On the other hand, what does that do to relationships within the community? How does that transform people's understandings of the community or play into inequalities within the communities? And this is something that I think we keep struggling with, and this is why it's so important to see in these mapping processes that there's an interlocking set of power dynamics that are always in play. There's capitalism, there's colonialism, there's gender issues. They're all sort of interlock in this, and this is a really great way to kind of sort of engage with that. And I think that that's what the spirit, what a lot of these mapping projects take. And especially, I think that some of the work that Davi has done with Alfredo is exemplary in this regard about how you kind of think those questions through and how they factor into mapping.
We have one more question from Alejandra Uribe. How can future work by radical cartographers help contribute to the process of delimitation of the natural resources for extraction and or conservation?
I might just venture in a little bit. One, I think, is that, you know, there's been a real shift in community mapping away from just mapping the territories people wanted to defend to mapping how extractivism takes over lands, right? And this can do everything from just having good, accurate maps of resource concessions. And, you know, again, to use another example from Oaxaca, Surco did a great project recently looking at how the maps they had of mining concessions in Oaxaca from the Mexican government were in fact wildly inaccurate and showed a lot of mining concessions that were just displayed cartographically wrong. And so they went to the Canadian Securities and Exchange Commission equivalent and dug information out of those reports that mining companies file in Canada about where the concessions are and produced a much better picture of where mining concessions are in Oaxaca and how they are sort of organized. So I think that that push towards sort of really getting a handle on how it is that extractivism works is really crucial. On the flip side of that, you have the chapter from Alfredo Viteri and Alejandra Lamina, where they're talking about Sumakalpa. And for those of you who read the chapter, you'll find that Sumakalpa is kind of the framework for understanding other concepts that are better known, like Sumakausai or Buen Vivir, but you have to have this larger sort of spatial perspective on it. And one of the things it does is it challenges our very understanding of what nature is, that often, again, informs and guides mapping processes, especially when there's a conservation element. But it also sort of, in refiguring that, it asks us to sort of take a much more deliberate attention to how resources are themselves kind of produced. What's the process that produces something as a resource, or produces something, even if it's just a natural resource like a area of forest, right? And mapping, again, plays a tremendous role in that. And in the production of these resources that I think the Viteri and Lamina and also Maria Nahuelpan's chapter really speak to in a very provocative way.
Thank you,
Bill. I just wanted to also mention Wendy Pineda's chapter as well, where she really discusses how mapping is not necessarily, I think we're getting away from a fixation on limitations and boundary making, because that's often has been very problematic, and thinking more about mapping as a metaphor and as a springboard for developing understanding and co-producing understandings of both challenges and incursions and extractive processes. And Wendy, for example, is explaining how within the parameters of a mapping project, there is communities in Rio Corrientes are actually monitoring mining activities, monitoring environmental spills from oil companies and so forth. And so it becomes, mapping becomes sort of this point of entry into a multitude of engagements and understandings of landscapes and processes and extractive processes. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. We answered all the questions that we got. Before passing the microphone to Pilar, I want to say that when we started this in Colombia, neither you, Bjørn, or I had gray hair like we have now. This is how it has been. Now, our Associate Director, Pilar Zazueta, is going to close on behalf of Diaz BENSON.
Thank you, Paloma. You all look great with your new looks. So on behalf of the Teresa Lozano Long Institute of Latin American Studies and the Nettie BENSON Library and Collections, better known as LLILAS BENSON, I just would like to say how proud the institution is about this initiative. LLILAS BENSON is delighted to have played a part in this collaborative project, which is that transdisciplinary, and that for us is very important, a multilingual process of production of knowledges, in plural, of saberes. I am confident that this book and these experiences will be important not only on their own, but as building blocks for other projects. As a historian of food and nutrition, I can see the possibilities and in some cases the realities presented by these radical cartographies for the studies and practice of agroecology, for example, for critical studies of nutrition, and for the construction of, for example, educational materials like nutritional guides and information in Latin America as a collectively based experience such as yours. Instead of an imposition by the state, that sometimes this is how these things play out in our continent. The book also invites us to reflect on our current lived reality of extractivism and encroachment, as you all have explained and mentioned in this presentation, the consequences of which are felt in our current and past human and ecological losses. They are visible in our orange skies in this continent and others. So thank you to all the communities and individuals that made this book a reality, to our scholars here at the University of Texas and to scholars in other parts of Latin America and the US. Muchas gracias. It was a pleasure to read and to present this book.
Thank you, everyone. We will be sharing any resources and links on our Facebook page. Stay tuned about that. Thank you, everyone, and congratulations.
Congratulations.
Bye.